Good morning, everyone. My name is Gavin Starks. I'm the founder of Icebreaker One. And today we're going to go through one of our programs here called Project Cygnus, which is looking at how do we facilitate a green economic recovery from COVID. Today we've got various partners here from across the group. We've got Ewan Robertson from the Global Finance Open Finance Centre of Excellence, and various team members, which I'll introduce as we go. But the focus for us during London Climate Action Week is to really highlight the practical steps that everyone can take to try and deliver net zero. You know, we're really into our decade of action with COVID as another disruptor. And as we go through all of this presentation today, there is a chat room. Please feel free to ask any questions or make any comments or start conversations using the Zoom chat as a side channel, back channel, and we will take questions. We'll dedicate questions for the end of the session. We've left a good chunk of time there as well. So what I'd like to do now is just hand over to Ewan, and then we'll get a description of what everybody has been working on. Ewan.
Thanks, Gavin, and good to be here talking about this actually today. It's exciting. I'm from GovCo. It's a bit of a mouthful to say. It's Global Open Finance Centre of Excellence, which is focusing on the recent improvements in open banking infrastructure and open finance infrastructure to deliver a sort of a collaboration between regulators, financial services businesses, and academia. And it's a startup with seed funding from UKRI Strengthened Places Fund, and we're looking to become a sort of self-funded organisation by 2025. There's essentially three things that the GovCo is going to deliver: an economic observatory trusted by organisations and governments to handle personal data. It's looking to identify, ingest, store, manage, analyse and disseminate information and data securely, and then combine financial data with secondary sources of information, such as climate change information, to deliver for policy and research. We're also looking at a technical standards board, looking to create standard access and protocols for open finance and trying to introduce that globally. And we're also introducing an innovation sandbox, again, to provide data and standard APIs for organizations to come in and test their business models, test the infrastructure required and make technology implementations possible for them quickly. We move on to the next slide. So we've been working with UCD, one of the partners in Project Cygnus. They have already been doing a lot of work on climate change and businesses, looking at open data available from Companies House. We've been looking at COVID-19, at SMEs, with using data actually from banks and cloud accounting platforms, which is quite detailed, close to personal information, so closed data not available really anywhere else for analysis. And we've been looking at how best to combine that kind of personal information and look at data available elsewhere. So this is the sort of infrastructure we're looking at here. So we wanted to find and bring in data from other places, looking to onboard it into GovCo's infrastructure, store it, manage it securely, allow people in to analyze that data and share the information coming out of it. So for that, we essentially need people to do this. We need a technology platform to enable us to do this, several technology platforms to enable us to do this, and an information governance architecture, which will enable us to handle data securely and provide access securely to that. Now the final slide. So I mean, our Inception project was looking at the impact on SMEs of COVID-19 and of policy interventions to help manage the impact on SMEs. So we've got access, as I said earlier, to SME data from several sources. And we're just using that really essentially as a model to provide the infrastructure for Cygnus. So we need people to do that. We need data scientists. We need information administrators. We need people enthusiastic about the outcomes possible from this, so that we can get organizations to share their data with us for research purposes. And we need commercial and sales teams to sell this data on and to look for funding for projects such as this that make such an impact to the world going forward. In terms of the technical and security infrastructure, the University of Edinburgh has something called a parallel computing centre and a data safe haven. And it's on this that we hold personal information to do with health records, actually. So, and we're using that for the SME project that we're doing at the moment to hold the bank's data. And it's essentially a database capable of holding a great amount of information in data lakes. And it enables us to manage the access securely to that. Golf has its own team delivering the information governance. And we're looking to set up the infrastructure so that we can quickly move to delivering projects in the one infrastructure over and over again.
Thank you, Ewan, for that overview of the University of Edinburgh's Global Open Finance Centre of Excellence. And I think the nature of the data flows that we're trying to encourage into a analytical marketplace here are extremely sensitive. So having access to the National Data Safe Haven and the Parallel Computing Centre are incredibly valuable in this work. We're also very keen to work out who's on the call with us. So if I could ask Anne to launch our first poll here. We're going to be doing polls throughout to keep everybody engaged. And the first question is, what is the current focus of your work? So if you could just fill that in as we're going along here. And I'm going to move us while we're doing that onto our next speaker, who's Fabiola Schneider from University College Dublin. Fabiola.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Gavin, and thanks for Ewan and Work Package 1 for the insights. I'm Fabiola Schneider, and I'll be presenting the statistical analysis as carried out by us from University College Dublin, UCD. Our objective was to analyze the economic impacts of COVID-19 on small and medium-sized enterprises across green, grey, brown industries in the UK and Ireland. We based our analysis on two types of data. On the one hand, we use company register data, which provides information on company type and nature of business, but also location. Additionally, we relied on investment data for companies innovating in the green sector. And overall, our analysis spans from January 2015 to September this year. The first thing we had to develop was a classification system to distinguish between green, brown, and gray industries. For green, we followed mostly the SASB definitions in combination with subsectors as defined in a research paper that was published this year. I'll put that in the chat for anyone interested, actually. Then for the brown industries, we mainly focused on fossil fuel energy, and gray in the end is just everything that doesn't fall under one of the two definitions as mentioned earlier. Naturally, gray firms vastly outweigh green and brown firms, but we found that for the entire period from 2015 to now, the number of new green incorporations on average is close to double the amount of brown firms. That's what you can see on the graph on this side. And we can see that in 2020, it's even the largest green peak. So despite the pandemic, there is an increase in green incorporations per year. On the other hand, for brown firms, we see a slight downwards trend in newborn incorporations, which is not the same as for green and very promising. There's a substantial difference in investment scale between Ireland and the UK, hence we need to do a regional analysis. On the next slide, we can see a map of the UK. Yep. This is showing the amount of green business births since 2015 aggregated. A larger bubble corresponds to more new incorporations. Very obviously, England is home to the most new incorporations with an enormous bubble in and around London. That being said, there is further green centres, for example, around Cardiff, but also Scotland. Given the different investment scales, our analysis will further include growth changes for more comparable results. When we look at the financial side of things, debt funding, nope. Oh, that's the poll. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute, I guess. Yeah, so on the investment side of things, debt funding to green companies saw a steady and steep increase, with project finance being the main component and driver of this growth. On the right, we can see a split into green subsectors, which received the most funding. Clear champions are environmental, data science, and software, followed by low carbon finance and consultancy. We also have batteries in there, and when looking at renewable energy, solar comes first, followed by wind, and then in the end there's hydro as last. However, the most striking preliminary finding is shown on the last slide. Yep, that's the green versus brown recovery after the declared pandemic. So the WHO in March declared that COVID was a global pandemic, and April 2020, the following months, was then the worst for all regions and all sectors, really. But the months after, we can see a steep increase and a much steeper increase for green. So the recovery of green incorporations was much more pronounced than the one of browns, and browns still keep going down while we see an upward trend for green investment, which overall means that green growth appears to be more resilient to crisis than brown, which is a very motivating finding. And I'll leave on that note and hand over to work package 3.
Great, thanks, Fabiola. And I notice on the audience poll there, we've got quite a number of people coming in from finance and investing and city and regional planning and local government, which is fantastic. I also note that there's quite a number of people who've selected none of the above. So if you feel so inclined, we'd love to know which industry or which sector you're coming in from here. So if you did click the none of the above category, feel free to put your sector into the chat room. And just before I pass over to Nick as well, I'd like to launch a second poll, which is, are you currently involved in developing COVID-19 recovery plan for your local authority or for your business or for your organization? And if we could launch that poll now, great. And I will now pass over to Nick Tyrone, who's leading our policy work at Icebreaker 1.
Thank you very much, Gavin. So what I've been attempting to do with the policy work at Project Cygnus is try and come up with the 3 best policies that would help the economic recovery from the COVID crisis in both the UK and Ireland to be as both sustainable and local as possible. So how can we combine those 2 goals as best as possible? How can we make the economic recovery, which we obviously need to do from the crisis, as green as possible, but also how can we localize it as much as possible? And to that end, we started to research 4 key areas. One was the financial impact of COVID on the UK and Ireland. So how bad a crisis are we facing in terms of economics? Secondly, where the UK and Ireland were on carbon emissions pre-crisis. So before we got into any effects that lockdown might have had, positive or negative, on the environment, where were the UK and Ireland in sort of macro terms in terms of handling carbon emissions? Thirdly, what the UK and Irish governments are planning in terms of sustainable COVID recovery. So what is actually being planned by the 2 governments at the moment for tackling this crisis and making sure the COVID recovery is green and local? And finally, what impact more people working from home had on the environment. So looking at how people working from home actually genuinely affected the environment. So if you like, looking at the in point 2 was looking at the pre-crisis emissions. But then the 4th one was building in, well, what has the crisis actually done for, and what can we tell about people working from home in future as best we can based on the data that we have at present. So that's that slide. If we can move on to the next one. Right. So what are our findings so far from doing that research? Well, one is the crisis has fallen hardest on small to medium sized enterprises. That's true in both UK and Ireland, and isn't that much of a surprise. That's quite intuitive when you think about it. Obviously, larger companies are going to be able to adjust to a greater extent to something like the COVID crisis than small or medium enterprises, some of which might have been devastated by lockdown for various reasons. Secondly, that it's important to look at the UK carbon emissions. You can easily spin it as being incredibly positive. Over the last 3 decades, carbon emissions have come down by 39%. Leading up to the COVID crisis, but it's important to know that that was completely offset pretty much by the importing of carbon heavy goods into the UK. One of the reasons why carbon emissions had fell so drastically in the UK over that period was there were lots of things that went into that, but one of the things that needs to be mentioned was the UK declined greatly as a manufacturing nation during that period of time, importing a lot of its goods. So and also, you know, so basically the idea being, if you stop manufacturing and you cut down massively on your carbon emissions as a result, the problem is if you then start importing carbon heavy goods from China, Russia, wherever else, that's obviously going to offset that, which is what we found had in the main happened. Meanwhile, in Ireland, it was a very different story. Manufacturing greatly increased, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, and that led to carbon emissions. Basically, that put carbon emissions up, which then you had some mitigating factors and some green policy which had managed to minimize that. But basically what you had was something where the carbon emissions in Ireland had basically come out roughly even. So what we found is, even though the UK and Ireland had come at this had very different stories to tell, you sort of ended up in the same position, which was not really enough is being done at present. So in terms of what the UK and Irish governments are actually doing about green COVID recovery, the UK government has set aside a 350 million pound package, which is specifically around green COVID recovery, which is obviously not nearly enough and is insubstantial. Now, times move quickly. Obviously, over the weekend, we've had this big shakeup at number 10. And there is rumored to be some more green policy coming our way. It hasn't been announced publicly yet, but I'll be looking out for that to see if hopefully that adds on to the rather disappointing 350 million package the government announced back in July. That was announced. Ireland's 7.4 billion euro package is obviously much more impressive. That's not entirely, I should mention, that's not all entirely, that's not a green COVID recovery package. That's the whole package of economic recovery from the COVID crisis in Ireland, but it should be meant that around a quarter of which, if you go through and identify, is actually green policy. So that's good. That's better. And finally, fewer people are looking to work from home post-crisis than popularly discussed. So what we found from this, if you look at the polling, and I think there needs to be more polling, but there was a big YouGov poll which looked at how many people want to work from home all the time as compared to pre-crisis and then now, and it's gone up, but not very much. What has gone up quite a bit is people wanting to work from home some of the time as compared to the crisis. So what we have there is people like working from home, but they also like the office. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out post-crisis. Obviously, it's too early to know. And that actually has played into the next bit of work in terms of that lack of knowledge. So next slide, please. So then we finally come to, okay, fine, what does all that mean in terms of policy? What did we get out of that research that then informed what we want to say about policy, and indeed, what policies did we want to pick? And in terms of identifying the policies, we came up with loads of them. There's all sorts of things you can obviously do to make the COVID recovery more green. So how did we decide which 3 to go with? There was 4 criteria. Which was basically what had the most cross-spectrum political support. So what I was looking to do is not just look at something that was entirely beloved by the center left, but also had some pickup on the center right, so that you could kind of say, you know, everybody kind of agrees roughly with this idea, or at least sees the merits in it. 2, which has the greatest bang for a buck. So obviously what could be done. You know, obviously there's things that could be done that'd be incredibly expensive. Obviously, if you're looking for, part of this is not just green recovery, but obviously it has to be an economic recovery. So if it had to be money efficient. 3, which would work regardless of the work patterns during and after COVID recovery. So what I didn't want is to make huge assumptions about how people are going to work after the crisis is over, whenever that is, or during perhaps the long tail of COVID. I just felt, looking at the the work that was out there, the polling, etc., it was actually difficult to come to any sort of solid idea of what that would be like. And so what I didn't want to do is pick policies that would only work if everybody worked from home, or if everybody went back to the office, or something in between. And then finally, probably the most importantly, is what would create jobs. Again, coming back to the idea that yes, this is about green, this is about local, but it's also about economics. It's also about the fact that this has to be, we want this to be an economic recovery, which is also green and also local. So those were the 4 criteria. And the 3 policies that we're looking at the moment are retrofitting of housing stock. So again, that comes into the idea of, if more people are going to be working from home, there's a worry that you could have, particularly during the winter, this could have a negative effect on the environment, with more people burning energy in energy inefficient homes. So, and this is something we have to do anyway. So even if people don't totally work from home, retrofitting of housing stock in UK and Ireland is long overdue. And so that's something we felt that was a definite in there. Encourage the development of sustainable transportation. So that's electric vehicles, but also that could be a wide range of things that we're looking at in terms of sustainable transportation. That's going to be completely important. Again, more people, commuting patterns, we don't really know at the moment, but one of the things we found is, which can be counterintuitive to people who live in big cities, I think most of us think about, or the suburbs of big cities, is most of us think about, we have this idea about traveling to work as being, trains and buses, etc., or walking or cycling, whereas actually it turns out about 60% of people across Britain use their cars. It's actually it's much more widespread than you might think if you live in London or Manchester or Birmingham. So so encouraging the development of sustainable transportation was obviously key, whatever the working patterns during the COVID recovery happened to be. And finally, better data infrastructure, because this kind of comes back to all of Icebreaker 1's work. We obviously need the data infrastructure to make all this work, and make anything work, and make actually all the policies that we looked at work. We just need better data infrastructure than we currently have. So we're going to be looking at ways that we can do that, and that will all form part of our final report, which is coming up quickly, actually. Looking very much forward to sharing our findings with the public. I'll hand back to Gavin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. That's really fascinating. And I think, when we get to the Q&A, I'll come back to some questions about how this fits with what the UK is currently doing on its retrofit plans and its recent announcements as well to potentially phase out petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030 as well. So we can see some movements there, but again, turning this into quantifiable evidence is a real challenge. I'd like to pass on now to Leanne Doody at Arup to give us a perspective there from the Beyond the Curve.
Hello, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present. So we are working on a project which is feeding into the Cygnus project, which is called Beyond the Curve, which is really looking at, again, the disruptive nature of COVID-19, what trends has it already accelerated, and then given that we don't really know what's going to happen, as Nick alluded to, what is the data that we need to be collecting and where from to be able to help us as city policy advisors, as city leaders, and as the general public make sense of this going forward. So I'll just quickly, I just have 3 slides, so I'll just quickly go through the context. So, obviously we have a number of challenges which are facing us in terms of sustainable development and this idea of building back better, around the kind of finite resources we have as the planet, how we live now. The urbanization is obviously a huge trend. Our sort of consumption-based economies is a challenge, and then we have climate change as a result of some of these things. Cities are our area of focus because they have a big role in how we go forward and how we live in the future. You've probably seen this statistic many times: 7 in 10 of people in the world will live in cities by 2050. and more than 80% of our global GDP is generated in cities. So in terms of places where we can have impact, cities are a focus for us at Arup in terms of sustainable development. That's not to say we don't look at rural areas at all, but in terms of, again, as I mentioned, places where you can have an impact, this is where we focus. And I think what we're seeing in terms of COVID-19 and the restrictions, certainly in the West around this, are disrupting how we consume and where we live, the kind of spatial distribution of where we are and where we work and what we do, and then where we buy it from and what we do with it. So if you could go on to the next slide, please. So some changes in behavior are happening at the moment, and this is a kind of look at what's been happening since about March. And this is based on surveys done by ourselves with YouGov and some of the Leesman surveys. And I think just as Nick alluded to, most people don't want to give up the office entirely. So quite a big percentage of them, and this varies from 25% to 10%, depending on the survey that you look at, don't want to go back 5 days a week, though, to the office. Most people say about 40% of people would like to be in the office about 2 to 3 days a week. It's kind of around the 40 to 50% number, depending on the survey. So I think what's remarkable is that there's been a lot of surveys in the last several months, and they are quite consistent at the moment anyway, in terms of people's feelings about the office. So people don't want to go back to the office 5 days a week, which I think is potentially the quite disruptive thing, but they do want to be in the office some period of the time. And most people who work in offices who are now working at home have found that they have been able to maintain their productivity at home. And I guess what the question is, how as we go on through this, will there be a degradation in that? Or will it continue to be maintained as people just kind of get used to working from home? This is what we don't know. I think there's been a definite trend towards a more local style of living, and some of this is obviously enforced by some of the restrictions. I'm based in Ireland at the moment, and we can only go 5 kilometres from we're only supposed to go 5 kilometres from where we live. So obviously the local community is where you're going to be. But I think that people, one of our findings from our survey with YouGov was that 80% of people who are normally in the office did find that they appreciated their local community more during this time. And I think we're starting to see that's, again, anecdotally, we're seeing that across Europe at the moment. In terms of consumption patterns, again, consumption patterns are also changing in that people are ordering more online, and it is already people were ordering. Obviously, the rise of e-commerce has been a sort of consistent story for the last number of years, but again, that has accelerated massively under the restrictions that we're under. And I guess the question is, will that go back to the way it was? Will people's consumption patterns be permanently changed by this? And again, that's something that we don't know yet. Reflecting the trend to living more locally, a lot of funding has gone into active travel, both in the UK and across Europe as well. Given that, as we see from this TfL data, a third of all car journeys, this is just in London, are under 2 kilometres, and people use their cars a lot, and particularly those 2 kilometre journeys are certainly ones that for a lot of people could be substituted for active travel. So I think one of the things that we're seeing from transport authorities across the world, really, but certainly UK and Ireland, is that emphasis from local authorities on trying to encourage active mobility. And I noticed that somebody has put up there is opposition as well. I mean, this is the interesting thing, that we're also seeing opposition from certain parties. But in Ireland, we've seen stuff on Twitter about the big bike lobby, like big bicycles. I don't think there is such a thing, but anyway. So I guess the focus of our research, so that context, that things are changing. We're still at the very early stages of those changes. There is huge spatial implications in terms of where people are living and working, and then the knock-on implications of that on transport systems and water and infrastructure systems is potentially huge. And potentially, just to take transport, the business case for transport is based on a consumption model. If those consumption patterns change, in other words, if people are taking the bus or the tube or the train less, only 3 days a week as opposed to 5 days a week, that has potentially knock-on impacts in terms of investment. If people are traveling off peak, that potentially has the beneficial effect of flattening peaks and providing more capacity. So there are a lot of things to unpick here that we don't yet know. So our research is really focusing on what is the data that's needed, given that we don't know yet. What is the data that's going to be needed to help us unpick this and understand what the impacts might be? And then how can that data be made available and usable by key stakeholders, given that some data may be private data or be held in different places. And one of the things that we're doing then is to look at use cases for data sharing, governance and infrastructure as a way of both illustrating this and also helping us to understand it better. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Leanne. That's really fascinating. I think the combination, the kind of theme here is there's lots of potential for change here and lots of systemic questions about how does the changing nature of work itself change the demands on our consumption habits, our transportation needs, and our energy needs, and how are we going to try and bring all of those different threads together? And that does point us to better utilization of data to inform our policy developments. Just in terms of the blockers, I'm just going to launch another poll now. Of what do we think are the main blockers here for our cities and regions rolling out their COVID-19 recovery plans? And then while you're completing that, we'll move now on to Paul Connell, who's going to talk a little bit about data, possibly our most colourful slide of the day too. Thanks, Paul.
Hi, everyone. So it leads on really nicely from Leanne's talk there about data. So our role in this project is to explore the existing data, and we're trying to build tools using what already exists. Now, we're not building a tool to answer a specific question for us all here. We've already heard that there are lots of questions and less answers at the moment. But what you've got here is us exploring the data. You can find this later. There's one website with everything on it. We're talking about our work as we go along, so you'll see the blog posts. We're building data infrastructure as we go, so there are online Google Sheets with the data we're using, the description, the links, where it is, and we're building a prototype tool to measure the EPC status of the housing stock in the UK, to look at its age across England and Ireland as well. And then I've just linked something on the left there, which is something we talk about a lot at ODI Leeds, is just how mad statistical geography is in the UK. And that whilst we might say, okay, it's going to be really easy to present information, sometimes it can be really hard and really complex, because people in their own mind have a view of geography. And then we get into the administrative boundaries and the statistical geographies that we use that are completely non-aligned and not linked, and are very difficult to then process. So the two things I wanted to mention most are, by using data and building tools is the best way to find out whether our data infrastructure is any good or not. And I guess our role And the reason we're working with Icebreaker 1 is ODI Leads is all about answering questions with data and writing less about policy and strategy that might work in the future. So we're in the middle of this. We're trying to build things that will work. And I guess there's we're hunting for use cases and answers that we can answer that are going to accelerate and amplify the work of the Icebreaker 1 team. And we're really excited to be working with everyone to move this forward.
Great, thank you, Paul. I think one of the reflections here is that if you're sitting there as a local authority or a decision maker faced with diagrams that kind of give you the sense of scale of the challenge, it can be quite overwhelming. So one of the challenges here is to really work out how can we simplify all of this and make it relatable to as many people as possible, which leads me neatly on to Emma.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, really good segue there. So I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to keep this really, really brief. I'm also conscious that a few speakers have touched on my area of concern, which is communication. Now, one of the ambitions of this really exciting programme is to engage citizens or the general public in the work that we're doing. But it won't come as any surprise to anyone that getting attention at the moment is rather challenging. I mean, what we really want to do, I guess, is to get people to accept the notion that a net zero COVID recovery is not only possible, but actually beneficial. And certainly some of the data that's been presented in this session is good evidence of that. But in order to really engage people more generally, you have to have information that's going to be of interest and of benefit. And that's actually really difficult to do, or really difficult to find. As both Gavin and Nick said, the evidence is actually currently quite lacking, although I think that Project Cygnus, through the different work packages, is doing a really good job of beginning to change that. And once we've got that evidence gathered together, if we can make it into tangible use cases, relatable stories that people can really understand in a local context, as Paul has mentioned, then I think we've got a really good story to tell. But time has been against us for this project, and so we're really only just beginning to get to that point. So in the meantime, what we've worked really hard to do is to work in the open. And Nick and Paul particularly have been very proactive, and Gavin, of course, in this domain, at explaining the workings out, if you like, as we've gone along. And the other part of that is, I mean, you can put all sorts of thought leadership out into public context, but if you don't connect people with that, then that's not much good, because it just sits there and doesn't engage. So one of the reasons that we're doing our polls this morning is to really try and lever our audience, if you like, and engage our audience as we go along, so that people are debating and discussing the work that we're doing as we're doing it. And through that process, we have been able to find some great evangelists and some supporters who have helped to spread the word of the Cygnus work, and who have become more engaged in the work as we're going along. And we've also got some additional research. So some of the questions that you guys have been really helpfully responding to during this morning's sessions, we're just in the process actually of running a survey through Demos and Servation to try and dig a little bit more deeply into particularly how local authorities are addressing this notion of a net zero COVID recovery, what policies they have in place, and how positive they feel about those policies. And we're looking forward to telling those stories, as well as the stories that are emerging from University College Dublin and from our other partners' work. So it's a work in progress. It's incredibly iterative. We are learning as we go. We are, fighting for attention in a very challenging environment. So certainly when it comes to things like engaging with media, for example, that is really, really difficult, because as you would expect when it comes to the pandemic, the things that tend to grab attention are to do with the immediate health emergency and the immediate economic effects. But we feel that we are developing a fantastic and very substantial evidence base for explaining to people why it's really important that the recovery from the pandemic has to be a net zero recovery. So I think I'll leave it at that, because I know we're going to talk about how people might get more involved in what we're doing further on in the presentations.
Great, thanks, Emma. And just to build on that, I'd like to launch our final poll here. Just what do you think your city or region should prioritize for a net zero recovery? So we'll just launch that as we kind of go into the Q&A session. I think, I'd like to come back just maybe to start the conversation, come back to Nick. We've seen the UK, expected to ban the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030. That obviously has huge implications for our transport infrastructure. We've seen headlines as well around the 3 billion Green Home Grant scheme faltering just weeks after launch. What's the role here of maybe better joining the dots on our systems thinking? We've had lots of different elements here of changes in working patterns, changing in lifestyle, changes in infrastructure. How can we, what's your view there? How can we improve this situation?
So the first way I'd approach that question is, so I'm slightly worried about what we've seen a lot of in the last few years is a lot of targets thrown out. We'll do this by 2030, we'll do this by such and such, or we'll reduce this by 50%. And what's missing is the how. Well, okay, so how are you going to do that? And then when you kind of get to the how, you sort of think, I don't really see how this is going to get you to the targets that you've met for 2030. I just don't see, I'm not putting that together. So I think several things. I think one of the things is we probably have, we'll see. There's this rumor now that Boris is going to become more green. I'll believe it when I see it, but we have the government that we have in the UK. I think I think there's a lot of policy work that can be done. I think there's lots and lots of policy work. And I think that what we're doing, certainly what I've been doing with the team over the past few months is great. And I think we're going to have a great report, but obviously there's lots more that we can do. And I think it's really important that I think we're trying to make it as easy as possible for the government to connect the dots, as you say. Where does the data infrastructure match up with things like reforestation, but also electric vehicles? I think a classic one with electric vehicles is there's a slight chicken and egg problem going on, whereby people are put off buying them because there isn't quite the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure. But then, councils and stuff are saying, well, we're putting up this charging infrastructure and we're not having people use them, or so that has to be worked out. But I think all of that can be worked out. I think we probably have to unfortunately make it as easy as possible for the government in policy terms, so that they can kind of pick it up and run with it.
Thanks. And if I come to Leanne on that same question, one of the big challenges here is communicating the huge levels of complexity and the systemic nature of dependencies across. If you change the office-based environment, you change the commute patterns, that changes the energy demands on a system. How are we going to try and simplify this for everybody in that system to make the right investment decisions to drive us to net zero?
It's a really good question, Gavin. I guess one way is to try to use cases as a way of illustrating the nature of the problem, in terms of taking a slice of it. So, in terms of working from home, taking some scenarios around what that looks like, and then, what the impacts on transport might be. And also maybe looking at it in specific contexts as well. So, in specific cities or in specific places. I think otherwise people find it very hard to grapple with it if it's very abstract. We're probably, as people involved in this arena a bit better equipped to be able to do that. But I think that you need very tangible examples, I think, and a good story around it to be able to make the case. And I think the other bit is to try and illustrate value, where value might be accruing in different places. So what is the value to the city if people work from home 2 days a week? You know, what are the impacts of that, and where are the possible sources of value in terms of losing value and increasing value?
I think it's a critical question there, is the redistribution of value in the mix here. And I think those specific use cases in a parallel piece of work where we're looking at the energy sector, I'll just put a link in to the chat there. There's been a couple of questions on the chat room about, you know, how can we do retrofitting of buildings and the installation of electric vehicle charging points at the same time? Well, absolutely, we need to join those pieces together. And it's incredibly complex to do so, because they're run by completely different teams, and there's not the kind of level of joined up data and the level of joined up frameworks for getting those things done as we might all want. So I think this also brings us back to, you know, what's the investment case here, and the work that UCD have been doing to try and say, like, how and where can we help stimulate that sort of green growth economy. Fabiola, do you want to come back in on that question?
Yeah, sure. There were a few questions that are quite interesting on the whole green recovery. While we can't make any inferences about why this is happening, we can definitely say what is happening. Most interesting to us was to see the steep recovery in corporations. That definitely speaks to some hope, and that people are definitely picking up on this matter. Someone else also asked, where's hydrogen in our graph? That's the third biggest pillar, so that's definitely also a major driver in investment motivation there. Yeah, so we hope to investigate further which regions are driving this, and to make more local statements and see how this compares to the overall situation.
Thank you. Just want to come back to one of the questions, and I'll probably take one or two more questions and then wrap up. But coming back to Nick, there's a question here about, interested to know about a long list that reduced down to those three. You know, would green primary care or green hospitals have a significant bang for buck? What didn't make that short list that you know, we'd want to still tell the story about? I think, coming back to Emma's point, you know, we're trying to work very much in the open here to say, like, here's the long list of things that we thought about but either couldn't do or didn't think it was a good idea, and we'll be publishing all of these as we go as well. But Nick, what were your highlights of things that didn't make the list?
Highlights of things that didn't make the list. So reforestation was one. There's a couple reasons. One of which is it's incredibly complex. Obviously, given the time frame of the current the current report, I thought that having something really good to say about that, I think you just need more time. And a lot of people have tried to sort of, I think reforestation is absolutely crucial. I just think that what's missing is a really big idea about how to do it, and how to make it cost effective, and how you would do it. One a lot of people brought up was a sort of national sort of climate sort of thing for young people, which again is a kind of really interesting idea. But I think there's lots of pragmatic issues to sort out. How you would do it? Would it be mandatory? You know, I mean, all these sorts of things. How you know, the how there, which is obviously very key to what we're doing. So that was one. Another one was around looking at more local offices, which again, I just think we probably need a little bit more on in the process in terms of the crisis, in terms of seeing how the recovery is going to go. I think, you know, the vaccine and everything, I guess, has slightly helped, but I still think we're really in a position where there's just so many unknowables. And I think the idea of, will people want to kind of halfway? So will people want an office, but maybe offices closer to home? But again, how that would actually work in practice is just still, I thought was a little bit difficult to sort of tackle for that. So it's a combination. It's the four criteria that I mentioned, but also part of it is the limitations of the project. So as it stands, so how much time and effort, some of these things are such big problems, but I really do think that we need to tackle them. We need a reforestation plan. I just think that it will be complicated, and that's the problem with some of this stuff, is that
Great. So I think, just to wrap us up for today, the audience here felt that house retrofitting was a massive priority, and energy efficiency closely followed. I think here that my takeaway here is that it is a complex set of inputs that we're trying to deal with, but we've got one outcome that we want, which is net zero. And there's going to be lots of transitions and transformations along the way there. And from my perspective, that is a conversation that really does need to involve everyone. And what we're going to see, I think, is a lot of innovation coming from unexpected places. It's quite often the smaller the region or city, the faster that they can get things done, and they can actually join things up more. And I think here what we've got is the capability to take some of those examples as people are really innovating and making their own decisions, that we can start capturing what's happening and look at those patterns now at a scale that we haven't been able to before. The combination of the GovCo platform plus the various bits of analytics that ODI leads and UCD and ARPA are bringing to the table here are really significant. So I'd like to invite everybody, just as a next step here, we've got a roundtable on the 26th of November. Have a look at the website there at icebreaker1.org/Cygnus for more details. And just to finish up, as it's London Climate Action Week, we have two other events this week, one looking at climate ready insurance, and then one looking at open energy, which is the case study that I linked to in the chat as well. But I'd like to thank all of our speakers this morning and thank all of you for watching. The archive of this should be up later today as well, if you want to share that or look at any other pieces in more detail. And we'd love to hear from you if you want to get in touch. But thanks very much, everyone, and have a great day. Thank you.